I now look to Toby Young to continue the case for the opposition.
I just want to deal first with one of the arguments that Celeste made, which is that if someone is no-platformed, you're not depriving them of the right to free speech, so this isn't a free speech issue. I think there is an important point, which is, of course, if you no-platform someone, if they're banned from social media, if they're kicked off the BBC, they still can stand on a street corner and sound off. But to me, that doesn't really feel as though you're respecting their right to free speech. The right to free speech means the right to participate in the public square, in the conversation that's taking place in the public square. So if you no-platform people, you are effectively violating the most important aspect of their right to free speech, which is the right to participate in the debate, the public debate in the public square. I wanted to draw your attention, if I may, before I get on to the substance of my speech, to some... No, I've heard your previous point of information. I think I'll pass. Though I thought it was quite good. It's just a bit too long. But I think there is a misleading aspect of this debate, which is that everyone on our side of the House, I think I'm right in saying, is right of centre, and everyone on that side of the House is left of centre. And the implication is that the beneficiaries of defending free speech are going to be people on the right, and the beneficiaries and the people on the left won't benefit. They can take for granted that they won't be no-platform, so they don't have to defend the right for everyone, no matter what their views or where they stand in the political spectrum, to be granted a platform in a forum as distinguished as this. I think that's a mistake. I think that's short-sighted. We know in the past that the situation was reversed. It was people on the right who tried to no-platform people, and people on the left who stood up for the right to free speech because they knew they depended on that to protect them. And I think it's naive for people on the left to think that they won't, in due course, when power shifts, when fortune's wheel turns, won't in due course benefit from defending the right to free speech, the right to intellectual freedom. And we can see that's beginning to happen now. People on the progressive left, people who see themselves as part of the social justice movement, have begun to turn on gender-critical feminists, or what they call TERFs. And we've seen, as I think some of the other speakers have mentioned, people like Germaine Greer, Julie Bindel being no-platform, Meghan Murphy, a gender-critical feminist who started a feminist magazine, a radical feminist, has been kicked off Twitter for taking issue with trans orthodoxy. The left looks for enemies, the right looks for allies, the left looks for traitors. So in due course, the left will inevitably benefit from the right to free speech. It is in their interest. So it's not a partisan issue. It's not a left-right issue. No matter where you fall on the political spectrum, you will benefit from defending the right to free speech and opposing no-platforming. Okay. I think there are two big arguments against no-platforming, and I'll deal with the weaker of the two first. And I think we heard it in a kind of way from Celeste. And it goes something like this, which is inviting a person to take part in a debate like this confers legitimacy on them and their views. Or if not legitimacy, I think the word you used, Robert, was respectability. The union has some authority, and inviting someone to speak here, giving them a platform, is a way of sharing that authority, conferring that authority on them. Therefore, if you think their views are beyond the pale, have no place in the 21st century, to use the Labour MP Andrew Gwynn's argument for defenestrating the Conservative philosopher Roger Scruton, then you shouldn't give them a platform. Well, I've got a two-word rebuttal to that argument. It's an argument that Harry dealt with, I thought, pretty effectively in his speech, but my two-word rebuttal is Nick Griffin. So in 2009, the then leader of the far-right British National Party appeared on Question Time. 500 people protested outside BBC Television Centre, many chanting anti-Nazi slogans, and the decision to give him a platform by the BBC was at the time heavily criticised. The argument was that by doing so, the BBC was legitimising his views, and that would lead to a surge in support for the BNP. So the BBC's counter-argument was that by giving David Dimbleby, the other panellists and members of the audience an opportunity to cross-examine, to challenge Nick Griffin about his views, his Holocaust denial, for instance, they'd be able to expose them for the toxic nonsense that they were, and support for the BNP would fall. That was the counter-argument. Well, thankfully, we know that actually the decision by the BBC to invite Nick Griffin onto Question Time did not lead to a surge in support for the BNP. At the time of his appearance, the BNP was in the ascendant. It had just got 2 MEPs elected to the European Parliament, and it had 55 local councillors. After Nick Griffin's appearance on Question Time, support for the BNP nosedived. After people had had an opportunity to cross-examine him, to expose his views, to expose him to the disinfectant of public scrutiny, support for the SNP, the BNP, nosedive. In the next local county elections in 2013, sort of happened with the SNP too, but anyway, in the next local elections in 2013, the BNP was left with a grand total of 2 borough councillors in England, and at the 2014 European election, it lost both its seats. So believing someone's views to be wrong is never a good reason for silencing them. As J.S. Mill said in On Liberty, either the person is not wrong, in which case silencing them deprives you of the opportunity to exchange error for truth, or they are wrong, in which case your opinion will be strengthened by its collision with error. But there's another stronger argument in favour of no platforming, one that invokes Mill's harm principle. And the PPEists amongst you will not need reminding, but the harm principle states the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So the harm principle, it often comes up in these debates because it's one of the few things that people on both sides agree on. So the harm principle is invoked by the no platformers in 2 ways. First, allowing someone with particularly noxious views to air them in a forum such as this will cause harm, because for some vulnerable groups, merely hearing those views will cause them harm. So unspeakable are those views. Let's call this the Katie Hopkins argument. Second, that hearing certain views expressed in a place like this could lead to violent attacks being committed on others. Let's call that the Steve Bannon argument. And as before, I'll deal with the weaker of the 2 arguments first. The first argument usually takes the form of branding the view in question, the noxious view in question, offensive or triggering or disempowering or upsetting, and that merely hearing such a view expressed is damaging to some people's well-being, particularly members of vulnerable groups. I think Robert alluded to that when he said it might inhibit some members of minority groups from having the confidence to stand up and speak themselves. Well, I don't take that argument seriously. First of all, offence is taken, not given. And if we grant that the risk of causing offence is a good reason for no platforming anyone, then that's an argument for no platforming everyone. Someone somewhere will always find a particular view offensive, no matter how anodyne. Indeed, the view that offensive views should be censored is a view I find offensive, but I have no desire to deprive people who express that view of a platform. The proponents of the motion are welcome to go on offending me all night. To quote the great John Cleese, no one has a right not to be offended. And incidentally, by trying to protect people from views they might find offensive, you're not doing them any favours. As Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff point out in The Coddling of the American Mind, which I would recommend you read, robust mental health depends upon learning to deal with challenge and conflict, of becoming resilient in the face of opposition, not being protected from it. And I think that's particularly true for members of vulnerable groups. If you shield them from views they're likely to find upsetting out of some misguided protective instinct, you're going to make life harder for them in the long run, not better. If you're concerned about student mental health, Celeste, then you should encourage people to speak who challenge your beliefs, not no platform them. Okay, so much for the Katie Hopkins argument. What about the Steve Bannon argument that some views are so toxic, merely to allow them to be aired in a respectable forum like this might cause some people to harm others? Okay, madam.
I came to the Steve Bannon speech and sat and listened to it. I thought it was thoroughly reasonable, calm, and very sensible. And I'm very sorry that a lot of people afterwards, although it was up on the website, people said to me, oh no, I'm not going to watch that. Look at Steve Bannon, friend of Trump. Meanwhile, outside, we had a terrible protest. Racist scum, no intelligent conversation at all, and some members were prevented from entering into the chamber by those people outside, people who wanted to hear him.
Can I just ask, were any hate crimes committed in Oxford on the evening that he was allowed to talk? Were any vulnerable groups attacked by white supremacists, empowered by seeing Steve Bannon giving a license to speak? But no.
People who were violent were the progressive left outside.
Okay, thank you. That's a very helpful point. I think the problem with the argument that allowing some people whose views you disapprove of, that no platforming them is justified because it might prompt some people to harm others, is the word might. Again, it's far too elastic a standard. Any point of view, however benign, might, under certain circumstances, cause someone to harm someone else. And it seems to me that the no platformers are obliged to show that the expression of a particular point of view will cause harm, not that it might cause harm. And why should the burden of proof be on the side of the proponents of this motion and not on us? Because the right to free speech is a natural right, an inalienable right, a right that forms one of the pillars of our civilization. It's not something we are granted by a munificent public authority. It's a right we're born with as free men and women. As such, the burden of proof is not on us to make an argument as to why we should be able to exercise that right. Rather, the burden of proof is on those who would take it away, on the proposers of this motion. So it's not enough, I'm afraid, to show that Steve Bannon, by giving him a platform at Oxford, it might lead, it could lead to other people being harmed. You have to show that it will, and that it will in the immediate future. And while I don't think that's an impossible standard, I think I'm meeting your challenge, Robert, of saying no platform unless. I think there are circumstances. Julian Assange, for instance, I think allowing him to publicise sensitive intelligence information which leads to the death of agents in the field, that is an unless for me, and I would no platform him if he wanted to reveal that information. So I've met your standard, but I think it's an incredibly high standard, and I don't think your side has met it yet. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I beg to move.